Previously, I did a video showing off how I stay motivated while batch painting and doing large army projects. The keys are really a combination of mental fortitude and techniques that provide fast wins. One of the best techniques that can provide quality looking paint jobs very quickly is airbrushing. So today's video is a comprehensive tutorial on how I use my airbrush. I'll be showing you how I use my airbrush to paint my models, how I maintain my equipment, as well as some troubleshooting tips on fixing common issues that I've come across during my time using my airbrush. So to start with, it's important to familiarize yourself with the airbrush that you're using and be able to take it apart and put it back together again. I'm working with my main workhorse airbrush, a Masters G25. I'm going to start by unscrewing the cover from the back, then the nut that holds the needle in place. After that, I'll carefully pull the needle out. Next, I'll unscrew the adjusting screw, then pull the spring out, then the needle chucking guide, take the trigger out, unscrew the cap from the front, and finally unscrew the valve body that connects to the hose. The one piece that I will almost never take off is the nozzle, and I'll go into that later. To put it back together again, you're basically following those same steps in reverse. I like to screw on the cap from the front, then the valve body. You have to do the trigger next. Then slide in the needle chucking guide, then the spring, the adjusting screw, the needle after that, and then the nut, and the cover from the back. Alright, now that we've put it back together, we can learn how to use it. So to start with, we're going to connect the hose from the air compressor to the airbrush and go ahead and turn it on. You'll probably hear some noise while it fills up the reservoir and the hose with air. My compressor has a dinky reservoir, so it refills constantly when I'm using it, so keep that in mind when you choose a compressor if you have neighbors and do this stuff late at night. At this point, you'll want to have some good ventilation and probably also be wearing a mask that will filter out the paint fumes. The very first thing that I do when I start up my airbrush is to run some cleaner through it. I just add a tiny bit of cleaner to the pot and spray that out into one of my empty waste pots. I have this nice one with a holder and filters, but honestly, you can also just use an empty jar. After I run the cleaner through, I also run some water through it. This is to push any cleaner through so that it doesn't mix with the paint later on. Now we're finally ready to add some paint to our airbrush. I'll add a few drops of airbrush medium or reducer to the pot, then I'll add a few drops of paint. This is the first biggest hurdle. You need the paint to be thin enough to not clog up the airbrush, but you don't want it so thin that it comes out watery. I'm lazy about this and buy pre-mixed airbrush paint because it's already in the consistency I want, but even then I still dilute the paint a tiny bit to make sure it's not going to cause clogs. When you're spraying out the paint, you'll push down on the trigger, which will allow air to come through, then pull back on it to allow the paint from the pot to mix with the air and be sent out. To stop spraying, you'll push forward to close the paint, while still holding down in order to maintain the air pressure. This prevents the air from being able to dry in the airbrush and clog. Get used to this action. Push down to let out air, pull back to release paint, push forward to close the paint, then let up to stop the air. Get that process drilled into your muscle memory and you'll prevent a lot of clogs in the future. I like to set my compressor at about 20 to start, because I like to thin my paint a bit. If you're using thicker paint, you'll need to set the pressure higher, maybe more like 25 to 30 psi. The important part is that you're able to get smooth, consistent lines with the airbrush, so just adjust the pressure if your lines aren't coming out smoothly. You'll increase the pressure if the paint is too thick, and you'll decrease the pressure if the paint is too thin. Also keep in mind that if you're trying to do fine detail work, you'd want to thin your paint even more and decrease the PSI, but that's a little advanced for what I'm trying to teach you right now. Okay, now we're ready to learn the main thing all beginners will want to do with their airbrush, and that's base coating their models. If you've gotten your paint to the right consistency and adjusted your compressor to the right PSI, then this part should be very straightforward. You're just adding paint to the model little bits at a time. The main thing to keep in mind while doing this is that you really want to keep the airbrush moving. If you leave the air blowing on the same spot, it can move the paint around after it's already on the model. If you notice that the paint is still wet while you're spraying the model, you'll want to stop spraying the model immediately and adjust the paint consistency by adding more paint and adjusting the PSI on the compressor. Other than that, it's just a matter of moving the model around and making sure you get a nice coat on each part of the model. Be sure to either have the model on a nice handle or something you can easily move around, or just be okay with wearing gloves. I get lazy and often just get paint on my hand and clean it off later. That's fine. Now that we've base coated our models, it's time to do a zenithal highlight. This means that we're using a brighter color only from above to help simulate the effect that light has when it strikes only the upward facing parts of the model. To do this, you'll need to know how to change colors. First, you'll dump out your remaining paint. I like to keep this little spray bottle with water on hand to help blast out as much of the paint as possible. After that, add airbrush cleaner to the pot. If you think you still have some dried paint in the pot, you might want to use a rag while the cleaner is in the pot to wipe out any remaining paint. Don't use a paper towel or anything with fibers because those can get stuck in your airbrush. Then we're going to spray that cleaner through the airbrush to push any remaining paint out. Once the cleaner is through, we'll add water to the pot and blast that through too. Now you're ready to add more paint. So getting back to the zenithal highlighting, we're just applying your new color to the upwards facing portions of the model. Obviously you'll want to pick a brighter color than the one underneath, and usually I'm trying to use the main color that I want the model to be. Now you could just apply the one layer and call it good, or you could use some white ink to take the zenithal highlights up to the next level. To do that, you can dump a bit of your paint out, add a few more drops of reducer, add a few drops of white ink, and really take the brightness up a few levels. Then mix that up really well and get ready to apply your highlights. When you apply this layer of paint, you'll want to only be painting the upwards facing parts of the model again, so you'll only spray downwards at an angle towards the model. Keep in mind that if you are holding the model upside down, you'll still want to be angling the airbrush such that you're painting the upward facing parts of the model. You also want to be quite a bit less liberal in the application. Just take it nice and slow. You can always paint more layers on later, but you can't really take those layers away. Now, depending on how bright you want the brightest brights to be, you may want to apply further highlights. For this layer, you'll want to apply the paint to an even smaller area of the model. You'll still only be applying this to the upwards facing parts of the model, but you don't want to cover all of the previous layer. This is to help build a gradient from the darkest parts of the base coat all the way up to your brightest highlight. You can actually add as many of these increasingly bright layers as you want, just make sure that you cover less and less of the model as you go up in brightness. Okay, so you know how to clean your airbrush, and you know how to use it for the basic stuff like base coating and zenithal highlights. Now it's time to see some of the other interesting techniques that you can use your airbrush for. A neat trick that you can do with the airbrush is to use stencils to add very detailed designs to your builds. My Genestealer cult captured this old Lehman Russ battle tank and wanted to add some visual flair to it. I cut a Genestealer cult icon into a flashcard and then used that as the stencil. You just hold it up to your model and then blast the area with some paint. I also did a little twist on this trick by inverting the stencil. I cut out a small soldier holding a sword and attached him with some sticky tack to this rock. Then I sprayed the area around the cutout soldier with red and pink paint. Next, we pulled the soldier away from the rock, and it looks like a soldier was vaporized by the beholder's eye blast. That eye blast reminds me of another common use for my airbrush, and that's doing easy one-source lighting effects. The first time I used this effect, it was for some torches on this dingy Underhive marketplace that I made for Necromunda. But you probably saw that I also did this on my recent 1490 Doom Castle. It's really as simple as carefully adding a light coating of whatever color glow you want to the area around the object that's casting the light. If you want particular parts of the model to be almost glowing, you can also paint them with white paint before painting them with the airbrush. I use this effect all the time on my Necrons to add green glow. So that's all the cool stuff that I use my airbrush for, but you might run into some hurdles that you need to overcome while you're painting, and usually that hurdle is a clog. When I have a clog in the airbrush, I'll usually wind up dumping the paint out, blowing cleaner and water through the airbrush until it seems like the clog has been pushed out, then go back to airbrushing. In worst case scenarios, I completely disassemble the airbrush and clean each part, then put it all back together. Sometimes I even use my sonicator to clean the pieces. I mentioned earlier that I usually don't take the nozzle off, and the reason for that is that one day this happened.
No, I gotta put this nozzle back on after I cleaned it, and let's just twist that back on there. Alright. It broke! It broke!
I managed to snap the nozzle in half and left half of it behind in the airbrush. It was a colossal pain in the butt to get it twisted back out as well. Ever since then, I tried just about everything else to clean out my airbrush and get rid of clogs before I ever think about taking the nozzle off. I really hate getting clogs because obviously it can really derail you from what you want to do. That's why I have a very regimented process that I follow for cleaning my airbrush and preparing it for my next airbrush session. This will seem crazy to some of you, but at the end of every one of my airbrushing sessions, I clean out my airbrush the same way I showed you earlier, using cleaner and water, and then I completely disassemble my airbrush and leave the parts submerged in water in this sonicator that I have. Then I run the sonicator for a few minutes. The next time I sit down to use my airbrush, I take the parts out of the sonicator and assemble it. If you don't have a sonicator, you can just use a little Tupperware container filled with water. Look, I get it, this sounds like a lot of wasted time, but hear me out. It only takes a minute or two at the beginning of a session to assemble the airbrush and a minute or two at the end to disassemble it. And by following this process, I can guarantee that I will never start my next painting session with a clogged airbrush. The worst feeling in the world is when you want to use your airbrush, and you can't because it's clogged. I never want to start a session with immediately having to troubleshoot and clean my airbrush. Instead, I've just gotten in the habit of always doing this at the start and end of my process. It's completely second nature to me now when I come down to use my airbrush. Maybe you'll have better luck with your airbrush than I have. Maybe your airbrush will just always work and you'll rarely, if ever, have to take it apart to clean it. I sincerely hope that's the case. But if you ever go completely crazy like me, just follow my process and you'll dramatically reduce how many clogs you get. Alright, well I think that's about all that I've got to say about airbrushing for now. Hopefully that was helpful to you. As you can see, the airbrush can be a very powerful tool that helps you get quality paint jobs done much more quickly. I use it in conjunction with traditional miniature painting with a brush and other techniques like oil washes to achieve what I need. Hopefully I've convinced you to give it a shot. If you're interested in picking up the same airbrushes that I use, I have a link down in the description. And if you have any comments or questions about airbrushing, feel free to leave a comment and I'll get back to you. Thanks for watching.